Now, as the title of the book suggests, it's literally a guidebook. It's one organized around particular sites. At the same time, it's a lot more than a guidebook in that we seek to tell a story, one about Greater Boston's historical geography. So in addition to focusing on particular sites, City of Boston neighborhoods, and various municipalities north, south, and west of the city, the book tells a story about the making of Greater Boston as a region. And what we mean by this, by region, is that it's an area that shares a lot. Right? It's characterized by strong ties within, and of course, lots of divisions. Right? We explore these ties and divisions, how they were made, challenged, and struggled over, as a way of trying to make sense of what Greater Boston was and is, while laying the foundation for it to become something else, something better, as was suggested by Suren's comments. This speaks to our approach, one that's explicitly from below, or from the political, economic, and social and ideological margins, what we're calling a perspective of the people. A people's perspective privileges the hopes and dreams and desires and struggles of those on the receiving end of unjust forms of power, and those who work to challenge such inequities and to realize an egalitarian Greater Boston. In this regard, the book is about the past, present, and again, as Suren said, the future, and that we try to take inspiration as well as instruction from those who have preceded us, right, in trying to further a struggle today to create a Greater Boston and the larger world that it reflects and is part of, that's radically inclusive and democratic, and that centers social and environmental justice. To tell the story we do over 400 years, we had to make choices, hard choices, but what to include and what not to include. What we hope to do tonight in responding to Claire's questions is to give you a sense of what we do in the book. So let me hand it over back to Claire now.
Thank you, guys. I think that was a really great way to talk about how the book is structured and, you know, why people would want to use it, because it really does give you context to what you're seeing around you that's not necessarily always visible, especially when you're in areas that are more heavily, you know, tourist focused. There's very specific things that they focus on, but everything that's kind of happened in the, you know, all that time around it doesn't necessarily get as much attention. So as they mentioned, that we're going to be focusing on 3 specific areas tonight, and we chose to focus on these areas because they correspond to places where historic New England has a presence. So the idea is to give you some more historical context around specific historic New England properties. So we're going to start with the West End and Beacon Hill, which is where we have the Otis House in Boston's West End, which is a federal style mansion, and was built in 1796 by Charles Bulfinch, and is the last surviving grand house in the area that was largely leveled during mid-century urban renewal, something they talk about in the book. And as the fate of this neighborhood suggests, during the 19th century, the West End was transformed from a wealthy neighborhood to a working class and immigrant neighborhood. And Beacon Hill, which the Otis House faces, was prior to gentrification, home to a vibrant and politically active African-American neighborhood. So when you go to places like the West End and Beacon Hill today, you don't necessarily see or think about the immigrant or the Black experience. So what can this book and the specific sites you explore in it tell us a little bit, tell us about the area around the Otis House and how this fits into the larger history of the city of Boston?
So I'll speak.
Eleni, you're going to answer that one? Yes. Okay,
yeah,
great.
I'll talk a little bit about this area. So as you can see, Joe has the map up on there, the Beacon Hill in the West End, for those not from Boston, very close to downtown Boston. And as Claire suggested, the area has seen quite a bit of change over the years. From the time English settlers arrived in Boston up until independence, Beacon Hill was used for grazing livestock and conducting military exercises. After independence, the State House was built, which we all know it's still the same. It's a symbol of power, I think we can all agree on, and still very much a landmark of the neighborhood. And many residents of the South Slope at that time were also part of that political power. Many families associated with the Brahmin class who were financially and politically linked to much of the industrial development in Greater Boston, the famous Lowell and Lawrence Mills. However, the North Slope was long a community of many African-born residents, which Claire mentions, starting from the mid-1700s. David Walker, who Suren spoke about, was an African-American abolitionist who lived on Joy Street in the early 19th century. Oh, and I should mention on the last slide is Oda's house, which Claire spoke about, which I'll speak a little bit about in my part on the West End. So David Walker was an African-American abolitionist who lived on Joy Street in the early 17th century. He was the son of a free mother and an enslaved father, and he authored an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, which was an appeal for Black unity and challenged white supremacy and the institution of slavery. He recognized internalized racism and the need for revolutionary change, starting within oppressed individuals themselves. His ideas influenced multiracial abolitionist movements, and his work was widely circulated. It even reached Southern slave states via various networks, many organized by Walker. The organized anti-slavery community was well connected nationally, and Walker participated in many publications and groups, including the Freedom's Journal, which was New York based and the first African-American owned and operated newspaper, and also in Black Freemason circles. And Walker, along with other abolitionists of his time, strengthened African-American claims to US citizenship. So this is kind of something that Claire mentioned. Beacon Hill in our imagination today is very much this fancy, wealthy area that's white for the most part, exorbitant rents and prices. And so as part of this book, we really wanted to uncover these stories that people often don't know about and are really important to the area's history. Another prominent resident of 81 Joy Street was the orator and abolitionist pioneer Maria Stewart. She was an African-American woman. She made history as an early speaker for many multiracial and mixed gender gatherings, speaking out against slavery and for women's rights. Nearby on 46 Joy Street is the former site of the Abel Smith School, now the site of the Museum of African American History. In 1835, the city of Boston opened the first public school dedicated to the education of African American children. It replaced the privately run African School, which was founded and run by Boston's Black community and was in the basement of the African Meeting House next door. For decades, members of Boston's free Black community had pressured the state and city governments, protesting that their taxes helped pay for the education of white children, while Boston had no school for Black children. As a result, the city officially recognized the African School and began providing some funding in 1812. But due to poor conditions and overcrowding of the facility, Boston finally agreed to build the Abel Smith School, which was named after a white businessman who willed $4,000 in 1815 to the city for this cause. Despite the building's newness, its conditions were inferior to those of Boston's white schools. This led to demands by Boston's Black community for educational equality. In 1849, most parents withdrew their children from the Smith School in protest of segregation. And one parent filed a suit in Massachusetts state court, which he eventually lost. The court ruled against the family, and the decision served as a precedent for the separate but equal doctrine that informed US jurisprudence for more than a century. So this is another story that many of us might not know, and I think is really an interesting one, especially around race and education in the city of Boston, which is something that many of us have heard about, in the 20th century and still carrying into the 21st century. So this need for equal school and school for all children in the city of Boston that's high quality has been going on for a long time. And I think it's important to understand where some of these organized efforts have started. So now we'll move on to the West End. And again, similarly to to Beacon Hill, what we know of the West End right now is it's very much a wealthy neighborhood with many big new developments, such as the one by North Station, which is this massive development of luxury condos and hotels, and I think there's a new Whole Foods there. But it wasn't always that way. In the early 1800s, the West End was a small area separated from the North End by Mill Pond, which was a small bay. And many wealthy Bostonians began building mansions there, which Claire had mentioned, like Otis House is the sole surviving example. But after Mill Pond was filled in 1820, there was much more area and in terms of land, and the area became a destination for African Americans and new immigrants, many Irish immigrants and later Eastern European Jews. By the 1950s, the area was a vibrant, diverse area with a dense street grid and mostly low-income residents, as you can see in this photo. But by the 1950s, the Boston political elite decided that, based on their metrics, the area was blighted and needed to be demolished. By the 60s, the dense neighborhood street grid and buildings were destroyed, and 2,700 working-class families were displaced. Here's a picture of the BRA, which is now the BPDA, the Boston Planning and Development Agency, formerly the Boston Redevelopment Authority, had these signs for urban renewal all over the city. But the West End is probably the most famous example in Boston of urban renewal and the complete razing of a neighborhood. So one of our sites in the book is the West End Museum. And the West End Museum opened in 2004. And while I don't have a photo of the museum here, I have a photo of the last tenement, which is at 42 Lamazney Way. The museum opened in 2004, but discussions around its establishment had started many years ago and had started around, by the editors of the West End newsletter and members of the West End Historical Association. And the West End is one of those, is a neighborhood where the BPDA has tried to, apologize and make amends about what happened, and it's never really clear what's going on around that. But at the dedication of, or the reception of the West End Museum in 2015, the director of the BRA at the time expressed his official regret and said, the BRA of today is in no way condones the destruction of neighborhoods and the displacement of residents that happened in urban renewal's wake. And he offered his heartfelt apology, but it's hard to, seeing these photos of this amazing neighborhood that existed at one point and now seeing what the West End is today, which is not accessible for many low-income immigrant families, it's really a shame that this neighborhood is not there for the people of the city. So the West End and Beacon Hill are both these places that have gone through immense change. They've been homes for wealthy residents at some points in their history, and then have changed to working class folks and immigrants of various ethnicities. And today are very much a symbol of the wealth and power and the elite in Boston. So, as part of this book, we hope that people learn these histories and why this happened, and we hope it doesn't happen in the future. So this is, movements that are going on today around redevelopment of various areas in the city and other parts of greater Boston are ones to consider and follow, because there are going to be huge implications on families and the future of these communities. I believe now Joe's going to speak about Salem and Newburyport.
Yes, thank you so much, Eleni. That was really interesting, and I hope that next time people come to visit Otis House, consider visiting some of these other places, because it really is a fully connected story of how Otis House is standing alone. Why is that? Well, the West End Museum tells you why. And I forgot to mention at the beginning that as we go through these, we'll be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end. So please put them in the Q&A function, type in your question, and then we'll answer as many we can at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can put that in the chat, and I'll try to help as much as I can with that. So the next area we're going to focus on is in North Boston, and two cities on the coast where historic New England has some of the most significant presence in Massachusetts, which are Salem and the area around Newburyport. Salem has, of course, become associated in recent decades almost solely with witch trials, and it has become an international tourist destination. If you live in this area, you absolutely have seen how insanely crowded it can become. In contrast, Newburyport is kind of a quieter neighborhood or town, and it's, draws tourists, but mostly from fellow New Englanders. But however, in Salem and Newburyport, they actually have extremely similar histories. During the 18th and 19th centuries, they were both sustained by international trade and the connections that their maritime industry made throughout the world. So Dr. Nevins is going to speak a little bit about the maritime history of these two cities and how it ties them to the foundation of global capitalism and American imperialism.
Well, thank you, Claire. Let me start with Newburyport. Okay, so Newburyport, for those of you who haven't been there, it's a small city of approximately 17,000 people, about 40 miles or so north of Boston. When English settlers first arrived there in 1635, it was part of what was called the Newbury Plantation. A little more than a century later, the General Court of Massachusetts created Newburyport as a separate entity. Today, Newburyport, with its quaint shops and historic architecture, attracts a good number of tourists, but not as many as Salem, right? Now, one place people like to go in Newburyport is Brown Square. And here's a postcard from 1913. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is where Newburyport's City Hall is located and various commercial establishments sit around the perimeter of the square. On May 31st, 1836, the Essex County Anti-Slavery Society held its first meeting at Brown Square. And among the speakers was John Greenleaf Whittier, a famous poet and abolitionist who was from Haverhill, not too far away. Now, established in 1802, the square was named after Moses Brown, right, who was the donor of the land, and at the time, Newburyport's second wealthiest individual and its largest property owner. Now, that the Anti-Slavery Society met at Brown Square has contributed to Newburyport's reputation, like many other places in Greater Boston, as a place of anti-slavery activism. But this reputation can also obscure the town's role in upholding and benefiting from the slave trade. The total number of enslaved people in the area was small. However, many of Newburyport's wealthy families owned enslaved people, Africans and Native Americans, by the late 1600s. Ironically, some of the enslaved people were involved in the building of ships, right, a number of which were used to perpetuate the slave trade, either by transporting locally produced goods to the West Indies, dried cod, for example, or timber, in exchange for sugar and molasses, and to the African continent, largely in the form of rum. This was in exchange for human beings. Okay? Moses Brown, after whom the square was named, was a merchant and a shipbuilder, and an investor in the sugar, rum, and molasses trade. And as such, like many in Newburyport, his well-being, right, was tied to slavery. Economically, Newburyport was so successful, that in the late colonial era, it was the richest town per capita in Massachusetts. According to a local historian in Newburyport by the name of Susan Harvey, 47 ships built in Newburyport were used for slave voyages. Over a total of 88 voyages, they were involved in the transport of over 22,000 enslaved Africans, 3,500 of whom died while in transit. Now, this reality, not surprisingly, helped to give rise to the local abolitionist movement I mentioned earlier. Of course, the movement was not merely local, regional, and national, it was also international. Central to this movement was the son of Newburyport, William Lloyd Garrison. He was born on December 10th, 1805. December 10th, by the way, is International Human Rights Day, much after 1805. And it just happens to be the birthday of my eldest daughter, right? That was not planned. This is where he was born, at this modest home on School Street, not far from downtown. William Lloyd Garrison would become one of the most important figures in the U.S. anti-slavery movement. His childhood years in Newburyport were difficult because his family was poor. Right? He was often, as a result, compelled to beg for food, for leftover food at the homes of wealthy families on High Street, right, which isn't that far away, and elsewhere in town. When he was 8 years old, his father disappeared. Before he was 10, he was an apprentice to a shoemaker in Lynn. Right? And prior to his 18th birthday, his mother passed away. It was during this time that Garrison, when he was only around 13, began working as an apprentice to the editor of the Newburyport Herald, where he remained until 1825. Now, despite having little formal education, Garrison exhibited great promise as a writer. He penned anonymous pieces that he would surreptitiously submit to the Herald, right, which then would publish them, right, under someone else's name. In 1826, Garrison, at only 21 years of age, would become the editor of the Free Press. It was then, by publishing his writings, that he befriended John Greenleaf Whittier, the famous abolitionist and poet from Haverhill mentioned earlier. In less than a year's time, Garrison sold the Free Press and moved to Boston. Through his newspaper work in social circles, he became increasingly engaged with reformist and radical political thought and involved in the abolitionist movement. After a brief stint in Baltimore working with a Quaker newspaper, he returned to Boston for good, co-founding the newspaper, The Liberator. Right? And you see here the masthead of The Liberator: "Our country is the world, our countrymen are all mankind." He got financial assistance from the Philadelphia Black businessman and abolitionist James Forten, and he was heavily influenced by Boston's David Walker, who Eleni discussed just a little bit ago. The Liberator was unique in that it took an uncompromising stance in relation to slavery. It would play a central role in what was known as the second wave abolitionism, which was marked by a demand for immediate emancipation, racial integration, and for full and equal rights for African Americans. Important figures in the abolition movement, both Black and white, wrote in the pages of The Liberator. But it was the words of William Lloyd Garrison, which were infused with righteous indignation and a strong commitment to pacifism, that dominated the pages of the newspaper. This incurred the wrath of many people in Boston, in the United States. It was actually an attempt in Boston to lynch him, right, in the downtown area. His offices, for a while, for those familiar with the city, were located in was known as Cornhill. Right? Cornhill still exists today, but in a very different form. If you look in the right-hand side of the photo, where it says coffee shop, this is the Sears building, right? We're looking down the street toward Washington Street. If we were to look at around 10 o'clock, we'd be looking towards Faneuil Hall. On your left is where Government Center Plaza is today, right? So this is the old Scully Square, which of course was destroyed in urban renewal, along with places like the West End. Right? Garrison's anti-slavery weekly endured until the end of the Civil War, coming to an end in December 1865. But despite the newspaper's end, Garrison remained active until late in life, championing the cause of civil rights and women's rights. He died in 1879. While he's buried in Boston at the Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, there's a prominent statue of him in Brown Square in Newburyport. All right, now Claire also asked about Salem, so let's move to there, okay? Now Salem had been previously, prior to English settlement, had been a native village and a trading center. Right? With English colonization, it quickly emerged as a key seaport and an important participant in the transatlantic African slave economy, right? Both through trade in enslaved persons and in goods for and from Caribbean slave plantations. The House of Seven Gables, which you see pictured here, which was originally known as the Turner Ingersoll Mansion, was partially financed in this manner. It was the Salem-based ship, the Desire, that first brought enslaved Africans to the Massachusetts colony in 1638. During the Revolutionary War, many Salem ship owners became rich through what was called privateering, right? And this involved them repurposing their ships to attack English ships and keeping the resulting war booty. Right? Following US independence, Salem's size and wealth further expanded. So by 1796, Salem was the country's 6th largest city, right? 10,000 people at the time. And Salem's customs house generated about 5% of the United States' national treasury revenues. It was also reputed to be the New World's richest city per capita. Much of the wealth was derived from trade with Asia, specifically around black pepper, valuable as both a spice and a preservative. Another reason that Salem was so wealthy is associated with the Peabody Essex Museum, right? Which is among the top art museums in the United States and home to one of the country's largest collections of Asian art. The original building still stands, right? And it has been incorporated into a much expanded museum. Here's the original building, the East India Marine Hall. Right? When the building first opened in October 1825 to help house the growing collection of curiosities, as they put it, right, of the East Indian Marine Society, it opened with great fanfare. Attending the museum's opening were Boston Mayor Josiah Quincy, a U.S. Supreme Court Justice, U.S. President John Quincy Adams, and John Thornton Kirkland, who was the president of Harvard University at the time. Right? Their presence spoke to the prestige of the society, whose members were largely what they call business agents or supercargoes, right? And captains of ships that sailed beyond Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope to Asia. It also spoke to Salem's importance to the emerging US and global economies. Right? So Salem was a central agent in the making of global capitalism. The town's dominance in the South Pacific spice trade was such that many referred to the region as the Salem East Indies. Right? Ships from Salem and Boston were so prevalent in East Indian ports that some people, according to historians, regarded the towns as powerful countries. Right? The pepper coast of Sumatra, right, today Indonesia, was a focus of Salem's trade. Between 1795 and 1831, there were about 400 voyages by US ships to the region, most of them out of Salem and Boston. Now in February 1831, a group of armed men attacked one of these ships, right? A ship from Salem. It was called the Friendship. And this is, for those of you who know Salem, this is not to be confused with the ship that's now at Derby Wharf that's also called the Friendship. This is a different friendship ship, right? Friendship ship, sorry, you get my point. All right, so people, a group of armed men attacked the ship, right, and plundered most of its cargo. And this took place off the shore of a village named Kuala Batu. The attackers killed at least 3 crew members and wounded several more. Right. 1 year later, a U.S. naval vessel, the Potomac, returned to Kuala Batu and attacked it in response, killing several hundred, including children. Now, obscured in the debate surrounding the U.S. military's grossly disproportionate mission of revenge. Now, some in the press applauded it, and there were some that were heavily critical. What was lost in this debate, right, was why the Friendship was assaulted in the first place. The aggressors, it turned out, were drug addicts, right? They were addicts to opium, which Salem-based vessels had been carrying to the region in exchange for pepper for some time. The captain of the Friendship, his name was Charles Moses Endicott, concluded that that the opium on board was worth about $9,000. Right? That was the reason, he said, for the attack. As a member of the East India Marine Society, Endicott, like others enriching Salem by sea trafficking in opium, would likely have contributed to the holdings of the museum, right? Or at the time, the East India Marine Hall. It was to this that the Peabody Essex Museum traces its roots. Now, as an aside, I should mention that Salem was not alone in being a center of opium trading and smuggling out of the greater Boston area. If you go to Central Wharf in Boston, which is today home to the New England Aquarium, that was once the home of James and Thomas H. Perkins and Company. Right? This was a company named after an old Boston Brahmin family that made its fortune off, among other activities, slave trading in Haiti and the illegal smuggling of opium into China. Right? And this was true of a number of leading Boston families, including the Cabots and the Forbes family, to which John Kerry, right, former Secretary of State, traces his ancestry, John Forbes Kerry. Right? So the Perkins Company ran its operations out of Central Wharf in the early 1800s. And with all the money they made, I think that the two principals were like the second and fifth wealthiest people in Boston, greater Boston, in the early 1800s. They helped to fund and found a number of key institutions which still exist in Boston, including the Boston Athenaeum, right, the oldest private library in the United States, and Mass General Hospital. Now, just as Salem is a lot more than witch trials, right, as Claire reminded us, right, it's a lot more than a place associated with wealth, US militarism, drug trafficking, and empire. It's also a place of working class neighborhoods. And perhaps the best known is an area called the Point, or in Spanish, El Punto. Right? Today, an area whose largest ethnic group is of Dominican descent. And this is a result of people from the Dominican Republic migrating to the area beginning in the 1960s and 70s because they had the skills needed by the local leather industry. A key neighborhood institution is the North Shore Community Development Coalition. And the North Shore CDC maintains more than 200 affordable housing units in the Point, which is just south of Salem's traditional core. Many of the CDC's buildings serve as the canvas of what is called the Punto Urban Art Museum, which was first established in 2015, but it's grown tremendously over the last 5 years. Today, there are literally dozens of beautiful murals decorating the walls of the neighborhood, right? It's well worth a visit if you ever get there. Right? So let me stop there and hand things back to Claire.
Thank you. That was fascinating tour of North Shore's maritime history and present day arts and immigrant community. I definitely am going to check out those murals next time in Salem. It's also a great reminder that even hundreds of years ago, there were so many ties between North Shore cities and Boston itself. People were moving back and forth all the time, conducting business throughout the area, and that these aren't isolated communities, that the whole area is tied together as it is today. So we're going to move on to another North Shore area, but a little bit inland. Historic New England has a significant but pretty much lesser known presence in the formerly industrial city of Haverhill. We have our large collection of objects, textiles, and furniture, and our conservation lab and other offices, and a former shoe factory in the city. Even though it's mostly known as kind of a post-industrial area now, Haverhill's history as a settlement predates its industrialization by 200 years. And when it was founded as a colonial town, it was on the frontier, and therefore was the site of violence between the dispossessed indigenous people and the European settlers who were moving into the area. And there's one particular story that illustrates both the violence of this colonial expansion, and it also talks about, or it can inform some of our current debates about how we remember and memorialize history, particularly with statues and monuments. So Suren is going to tell us about Haverhill, and in particular the story of Hannah Dustin, one of its more famous inhabitants in the late 17th century.
Indeed, this story takes us back to a very remote past, one that we don't really think about today. There is a semi-official narrative about Hannah Duston. Her story sort of is passed down to generations because Cotton Mather took down her story and sermonized about it and wrote about it. Sam Sewell, another judge along with Cotton Mather in the Salem witch trials, also interviewed her, took down her story, and from his notes we have additional details about her story. I'll run through first the semi-official narrative about her story. So we're talking about a period in the late 1600s, 1697. So Hannah Duston, in the spring of 1697, is captured, taken captive by a band of Abenaki people, together with a neonate. She had just given birth, and her nurse/neighbor. So 2 women and the neonate are captured. They are transported northward toward what at that time was New France, right? The French colony, the French corollary to New England, present-day Quebec and Newfoundland, right? And along the way, something happens to the neonate. She alleges it was killed. And then we get to hear the story that is now famous or notorious, depending on your perspective. About 10 days into her captivity, while the family holding her and her nurse hostage, or not hostage really, we don't actually know their intents and purposes. But this family was asleep. They trusted Hannah Duston enough to leave them unguarded and for them to go to sleep. While they were asleep, she escapes together with another captive and her nurse. However, they do go back and kill their captors. Among the captors, are 6 children. They too were killed by Hannah Duston. After she leaves, she realizes she needs, at least this is her account, evidence of the action. And she then, and this is quite ugly, she proceeds to scalp the family and take these scalps back with her to Haverhill. A trip back to Haverhill, think about it, this is early spring, right? At a time when the seasons were fairly predictable. So she fled on a canoe coming down the Merrimack River. She fled by canoe, navigating icy waters, parts of which hadn't thawed yet, some 100 miles to arrive in Haverhill. And when she arrives in Haverhill, the story spreads. She gets invited to the Massachusetts General Court, the legislature of the period, tells a story there, and becomes this heroic figure symbolizing womanhood and what it meant to live on the frontier, and at the same time a parallel story about the people who took her captive and their brutality, or their alleged brutality. And then the story sort of disappears into the 1700s, only to reemerge in the 1830s when it is retold, depending on Cotton Mather's sources, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, by Thoreau, by John Greenleaf Whittier. But it becomes a popular story again, starting in the 1830s. The first Haverhill statue goes up around the time of the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. The present day statue, the one depicted in the slide that Joe is showing you on the right, was built in 1879. Before that, the site of the original massacre that Hannah Duston executed in Boscawen, New Hampshire, they set up a monument there in 1874, making it the first, it's reputed to be the first public statue of a woman in the United States. So there's a debate about that statue and the present statue. I'd like to go to the next slide then and zoom in a bit on the statue. You know, as we know from another Hannah, right, Hannah Arendt, statues and monuments are not about what they depict. They are not about the dead. They are about the living who construct them, right? And so let's look at what's depicted in the statue, right? Is it a person? Well, from the details of the statue, we see a woman with a hatchet in her hand, right? And in a very, in a pose of almost cat-like alertness, you know, knees slightly bent, ready to move into action, right? And it was a sense of determination on her face. But we don't really have any other context for knowing or understanding this figure. Does this statue depict a time period? Does it tell us about what was happening in the 1700s, in the late 1600s, in the 17th century? Well, at that time, the very territory which Haverhill bordered, the frontier, as we described it, right, was a zone of contest between New France, right, the French colony, the French colonial state itself, New England planters, the British Empire, and the Massachusetts colony. In addition to these sort of European origin entities, the Haudenosaunee Federation to the west was also impinging on this territory, right? And then there was the Abenaki Nation, consisting of many different bands, together with other Algonquin-speaking polities. This was also in the aftermath of the genocidal war that's still called King Philip's War of 1675-78. What we don't see then are any of these things in the statue. The friezes below that pedestal, right, depict the actual activities. So this really depicts a particular act, and it comes about at a particular time in the history of Haverhill and in the history of the nation, right? One of the most important things is that Haverhill at this time was industrializing together with, as we know, Lawrence and Lowell. They were well into the industrialization, and a second industrial revolution was beginning in this period. Capital that financed all of this in Boston could no longer get any rewards out of that overinvested region around the Merrimack River. Instead, they began to move their money into westward railroads, right? Railroads that were expanding into the west. One of the reasons to, of course, build a transcontinental presence was so that they get access to the Pacific Ocean and therefore can participate more in the trade with China and Asia. So how does this story fit into all of this? Well, westward expansion wasn't into an empty, hollow space, right? It was into territory where real people lived, indigenous communities who had already been forced out, starting in the 1830s when the reemergence of the Hannah Duston story occurs, in the 1830s with the Indian Removal Act, right? In the period that our present president is very fond of, right? Jacksonian America, right? That's when we have a brutal expansion. And so it makes sense then, you know, more than 150 years later, to start to think about what happened in the early establishment of what would become the American state, right? I should say some other things about this period. Let me say one thing really quickly, though. The wealthy in Boston too were confronting new realities. So I'm not talking so much about Haverhill, but about Boston itself. Boston was home now to a large working class as well as an emerging middle class. The wealthy in Boston, the people funding the railroad expansion and all, they lived in isolated pockets in Back Bay and Beacon Hill. We know all of this from the work of one Noam McGaw, who wrote a book in 2017, or published a book in 2017, called Brahmin Capitalism. And so this seems to provide for us a context for the erection of this statue, right? We have now a sense of the uses of the story. To understand the story that I haven't told, right, please look at perspectives from the Abenaki people. Follow the link that's depicted on the slide. It's to our website, www.bostonbook.org/Dustin. And there are 3 links there to other stories that will have more to say to you about the Dustin story. I'd like to go to the next slide then, right? There are other stories that we could tell. One of them, though, is the fact that starting this year, right, while we were all in lockdown, is a rebellion against these kinds of statues, right? And so there were acts of vandalism against an official act of vandalism, namely this statue, right? And it reignited the debate about how we should talk about the past. How are we to present figures like Hannah Dustin? Should these statues just come down? Are there other ways of addressing this kind of question? And so let me ask you, Claire, do I have any more time? Or Joe or
You
Eleni?
can go on for a little bit longer. That's fine.
Yep. Does that make sense for you, Joe and Eleni? Okay. Okay, so there are other Haverhill stories that we could have told, and in fact, we do tell the story of John Chase, who lived from 1870 to 1937. He was a reaction to that Gilded Age that began in the late 1800s. He was a reaction in the sense that he became the first socialist mayor elected in the United States as a socialist. There are certainly other figures who had the same kinds of values who were elected in places like Malden and in Schenectady, New York, and across the country. But John Calvin Chase was the first elected socialist in the United States. He came out of the labor movement. He worked in shoe factories in Haverhill, right? And in fact, one of the nicknames for Haverhill was Queen Shoe City, right? And so he represented this growing working class, and they campaigned on issues like graded or the removal of unprotected railroad crossings, for the municipal ownership of utilities, as well as for things like public jobs to ease unemployment, as well as supporting the demands of the labor movement in the factories. So it was walking on 2 feet, right? Challenging at the political level in the city government, and at the same time, there were 2 representatives in the Massachusetts House from Haverhill as well. So this represented something quite broad. In 1901, however, the socialist mayor achieved something that that I think a lot of that maybe our present president has accomplished, which is to unite moderate Republicans and Democrats, all against the incumbent. So the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, together with the Catholic Church, united and managed to drive John Calvin Chase out of office. And at the same time that they did that, however, they began to adopt many of the demands of the socialist movement. So things like guarded railroad crossings, public utilities, public employment measures, all of these things were adopted as a result of the presence of this person who could help redefine the political spectrum, a disruptive figure, but someone who helped make Haverhill as well as Massachusetts a better place. So that would be another kind of story that we could tell. So I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much. I mean, that there are so many stories that you can tell about any place, and I think that's part of the beauty of the book is it takes you know, very different time periods, very different stories, and places them all on top of each other in kind of a history layer cake. But that's, you know, the space that we inhabit, and so it really kind of makes that a little bit more visible, that you walking around a place and you're surrounded, you know, by hundreds or even thousands of years of history, and you may not realize it until, you know, you look a little bit deeper, because you know, some of these places don't even exist anymore. So I think that was a great part of the book, was that you pointed out the former locations of places that don't even exist anymore, but had very significant events or people associated with them. And that how, you know, our contemporary landscape in some ways erases histories as well as makes them visible. So if anyone has any questions, please do put it in the Q&A. Someone did have a question about the last tenement, and you know, how it's being used now. Does anyone live there? And, you know, are there plans for it beyond just kind of being a monument to the lost West End? Do you, anyone?
Yeah, I responded to the question with a Globe article, but I believe it's a privately owned rental property currently. And I don't know of any plans, but my guess is that, you know, the value goes up and up every year. So who knows what they're planning. I don't think there are any plans for preservation as far as I know, which is unfortunate, but others may know more.
I think I do remember that Globe article you're referring to of people who actually live in the last tenement, which is really interesting that it's still a rental property and not a preservation, you know, museum or anything else, which in some ways is kind of fitting for it, you know, that it still has people living in it and it's, you know, still serves its function, but that does make it pretty vulnerable to the need for land and development.
It might be apart from a Catholic church in the Otis Mansion, it might be the only other building that remains of the old West End.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. It's very hard to imagine what the West End used to look like for when you go there now, because it is so different. So
you know who grew up there was Leonard Nimoy. Yes, I
remember that. It was a heavily Jewish area, and I want to give a shout out to one of the museums on Beacon Hill now. Oh God, I'm going to forget the name. There is one of the few synagogues that are left on Beacon Hill. What is? Oh God, I'm of course totally blanking on the name.
It has a V in it.
Yes, Vilna Shoal.
There you go.
It's somewhere in the Baltic. Yes, the Vilna Shoal just underwent a beautiful renovation of the of this one of the few, I think maybe the only Jewish house of worship of the many that used to be in that area. So that's another place I think that would be that's a really great window into what life used to be like on Beacon Hill in the West End. Does anyone else have any questions that we can answer? Not getting any. Right. Well, do you three have anything you want to add to kind of wrap up the conversation and you know, talk about how, you know, the book talks about maybe some other places that might be of interest?
Well, maybe I could just say something quick as we're waiting. Maybe people can think of other questions they want to ask, and you know, we certainly have other sites we can talk about, right? Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that comes through in our discussion is that we try to cover a lot of ground, both geographically and historically in the book. But one of the things we want to emphasize is that we're not trying to be comprehensive. Mm-hmm. Right? It's impossible to do so. We're trying to be suggestive in a way that sort of highlights the long contested nature of Greater Boston. In that regard, we're very aware of the fact that we're only scratching the surface or the many surfaces of the region. And at the same time, we appreciate that we're not the first people to write from a people's perspective about Greater Boston and the larger world. and we hope we're not the last. And so in that sense, we hope that one of the things that, well, we hope to be making a small contribution to the larger discussion, but we're also hoping to, inspire others to continue writing about their neighborhoods, their cities, their municipalities, right? And so Suren referenced that we have a website, right? And one of the things that we did in the book is we generated a lot more entries than we were able to accommodate, right? So there's about 165 place-based entries in the book, and we probably wrote about 240 or so. And so we had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. And so one of our intentions is to gradually populate the website with new entries. And at the same time, entries we've already produced, and at the same time, generate new entries based on our ongoing research. So if people have suggestions for things that we should be thinking about, paying attention to, we encourage you to get in touch with us, right? You can get in touch with us through this bostonbook.org, or communicate with us through Facebook. We have a Facebook page, and where we talk about all sorts of things. And I do want to, of course, before we leave, we want to thank Historic New England for all its great work. We did rely on Historic New England for some of its resources, and particularly some archival images that we use in the book.
Mhm.
And special thanks to you, Claire, for inviting us and for organizing this event and hosting it.
It was my pleasure. I'm so glad you guys were all three able to make it. That does go on to another question someone has, and how you three managed to work together to put this together. Because, working with three co-authors, I'm sure was, a little bit logistically difficult.
I mean, the reason we're in 3 different places right now is because we don't really talk anymore, right? We had so many fights. Who wants to take that one?
I mean, I don't think what I say will sound credible. There was not a single fight. There were occasional disagreements, but resolved by the second sentence of the person responding to it. So it was a really pleasant process. And I think one of the reasons it was so pleasant is I think all of us experienced a sense of discovery and excitement about the city. One of the things that Joe insisted on early in the process is that we be able to walk to the place, and so we take the subway to the nearest site or bicycle to it, and then go on foot. This allowed us to talk about the place, discover new things in the city. So I don't, there just wasn't any real room for disagreement. Where maybe Joe or Eleni will say more about this, but where we expected to disagree with each other was narrowing down those 240 sites to 165 that go into the book. And so we each made our respective lists, and we saw where they converged. Where they converged, it was easy. And I think there were only about 30 or 40 where we had, relatively different weights assigned to it. And those are easily sort of resolved by discussion, and also looking at what kind of weight we were giving to different neighborhoods. So that might leave us choosing a particular site, even if we were really invested in another one, in order to tell a fuller story about a particular neighborhood or community. Would that be about it?
It sounds like the question was also about how we came together to write the book.
Yeah.
I don't know, Joe, do you want to start? And
Yeah, I was supposed to talk about that, but I forgot to. Yeah, so this book is part of a series, right? There was a book published several years ago called The People's Guide to Los Angeles, and that was the authors were Laura Polito, Wendy Barraclough, and Wendy Cheng. And the book did pretty well. And so the University of California Press, which published the first book, decided they wanted to make a series of people's guides to various cities. And I happen to know Laura Polito, and she reached out to me and asked me if I knew anyone that would be interested in doing something in Boston, because they wanted someone to do something in Boston. And I had long had an interest in doing work on Boston, but I'm not at that time, and still, I guess, I'm not an expert about it. I'm not trained in Boston studies. I happen to grow up in Boston and I pay attention to it. But I knew, given sort of the breadth of the book, right, and the varied themes that would need to go and have gone into the book, that I couldn't do it by myself. And so I reached out to Suren, who's a old friend of mine from graduate school. We went to UCLA together, because Suren had been living and working in Boston for a couple of decades, and see if he would be interested. And Suren immediately expressed interest. And just by chance, Eleni happened to be in a class of mine during her last semester at Vassar College. And Eleni and I connected among other, on various fronts, but one front was sort of the greater Boston front. We both grew up on the Red Line. And so we would talk about different things. And what became clear to me very quickly was that Eleni was not only someone who grew up in the city, but was passionate about it, and was someone who got out and explored it. And so when Suren and I decided that we wanted to go forward with this, we asked Eleni to, if she would be interested in becoming a research assistant for us. Eleni said yes, and very quickly it became apparent to us that Eleni was a lot more than a research assistant. Not only did she sort of carry out the tasks that we asked her to do, but made the project her own and was writing entries, generating new ideas. And so then we asked Eleni to join us as a co-author. And so, this project, again, given its enormity, I don't think any one of us could have done it, even if we wanted to, right, by ourselves. We had to rely on each other in all sorts of ways, not least because we all had, very different interests, different limitations, different experiences in relation to the city. And so we all learned a tremendous amount in doing this. And, speaking of myself, perhaps the most important thing I learned was just how limited my knowledge is of Boston, which makes the project, both really challenging and, as Suren was suggesting, really enjoyable, because there's this constant process of discovery, and that process of discovery continues to unfold.
There was another question about why you didn't include anything related to the Freedom Trail. Was there a decision made about that, or was there just not enough room to include those sites in the book?
Suren, do you want to speak to that?
We do have many sites which sort of coincide in some respects with the Freedom Trail. So that's one dimension to it. At the same time, we wanted to explore stories that were less well told and less well known. And so, the Freedom Trail is almost an obvious place to start. And yet, given that it is so well known, I think that we made a choice to emphasize other stories without ignoring that. There are stories about the American Revolution in here, also told from a different perspective, though. I think we give more weight to, say, the French and Indian Wars, which preceded the American Revolution, as a necessary context for trying to understand the emergence of the American state. Look, there's a lot more to be said here. And of course, our talk today was sort of directed in many ways by the sites that Historic New England wanted us to talk about. But the diversity within the book is much broader, of course, as Claire noted. Joe and Eleni, I think you may want to add to what I've said.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, for all of us who grew up, spent time in Greater Boston, the Freedom Trail is something that's very important, right? It's one way we learn about the city. And like any representation, right? I mean, in some ways, the Freedom Trail becomes sort of the dominant story we hear about Boston. And like any representation, it helps to illuminate certain things and it helps to obscure certain things, right? Because it's inherently partial, just like our book is inherently partial, right? But we wanted to emphasize, as Suren was suggesting, other things that get a lot less attention, right? And partly that flows from sort of the political project that this book is part of, right? The politics that this book wants to champion, which is not to say that what the Freedom Trail has to offer is unimportant, right? But that's just one part of the story, and we're offering another part, right? And we see this as part of an ongoing dialogue, conversation.
Just to add to that, one of my first things I did for this whole project was I went to several bookstores and looked through existing guidebooks of Boston, and just wanted to see what was out there, what was talked about, and not just the Freedom Trail, but downtown Boston in general was kind of the only part of Boston that was spoken about. Some parts of maybe Harvard Square or kind of the really big tourist hubs of Greater Boston. And so this book, what I'm really proud of in this book is that we've done I think a good job of expanding what Greater Boston is for visitors, but also for people who live here. So folks that might not, travel to Dorchester or to the West End in the way that we're describing it, or to Charlestown, may now be able to actually go to a site that's described in the book, and that may not be normally described in kind of a mainstream guidebook. So I think that part of the Freedom Trail is part of that, and many other sites that we all know of. And also we have sites in the book that are in these mainstream guidebooks, and we speak about them in a different way, as Joe and Suren mentioned.
Eleni, do you want to just mention one of them, Fenway Park?
Oh yeah, so Fenway Park, we all know it. It's home of the Red Sox. Still, I actually saw the lights on the other day. It's a little strange, right? The lights are on, no one's in the park except for the players. But we write about Fenway Park in a very different light, as it was the largest crowd at Fenway Park was not for a Red Sox game. It was for a political action. In 1919, 50,000 people, with many more who were outside the gates, gathered there to demand an end to the British rule of Ireland. That crowd is 3 times larger than the number who had seen the Red Sox and Babe Ruth win the World Series the previous year. So it's just kind of a taste of these sites that we all know and many of us love, but seeing it in a different light. So different group of people, maybe some same people who enjoyed games there in 1919, but just trying to unearth these stories that are there and are often not told.
So we have someone asking about the representation of women in the book and in the talk. And as she said, we really narrowed down our focus for the talk tonight to kind of flesh out the history of the community surrounding a very particular number of historic New England properties. So we in no way were trying to represent what was in the book or any sort of real representative slice of everyone involved in the history of Boston. So can you talk about how you try to incorporate women's stories in the book, and how you thought about being intentional incorporating the history of women and other people who are gender minorities and who are oppressed because of their gender?
I'll take a bite at this apple. I think that we wanted to be deliberate about confronting the structures of power through history. And we told many stories that correspond to people at the wrong side of a power relationship. So, for example, we tell the story of Anne Hutchinson, right? We don't reduce it to a story of gender. We certainly deal with the doctrinal disputes, of the early Puritans when talking about Anne Hutchinson and her house. But we also tell it as a story of an incipient peace movement, one that would deprive that would deprive John Winthrop and the settlers of young men for their armies, because Anne Hutchinson, in preaching, not only contradicted the authority of the governor and the church, but she also sort of spoke about the need for peaceful relationships with the indigenous people. So she had a very different model of relationship between the settlers and the actual inhabitants of the area. So, and that would be one example. We have many other stories that involve leading roles by people, women of color, for example. I'm sure Eleni can tell you the story of the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Association. We could tell the story of the voice of industry in Lowell, right? A newspaper in which women played a prominent role, and in which someone of indigenous heritage contributed to another newspaper, the Lowell Offering. So there are many of these stories, and as you go through the index, I think you'll find stories that would be of interest to you. We had no absolute quota, though. And we'd hope that, you know, by telling stories about our bodies ourselves, we're telling a story that it clearly has a gender lens, but we're not sort of checking off boxes in telling these stories.
Right, just add on to that, please. So one of our sites happens to be Emmanuel College in the Fenway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Suren's alluding to in talking about Our Bodies Ourselves, a very central publication in the women's movement, in the history of the women's movement, in the history of reproductive rights struggles. And so we have a number of these sites. We have Sojourners, which is a very important feminist newspaper that was born at MIT, right, the birth site of that. We have in Cambridge, 888, is it 888 Memorial Drive, Eleni? Right, you know, an important site of an important action, if you will, in the in the late 1960s, early 1970s. When was it? In the local women's rights movement. So, you know, both, whether we're talking about someone like Phyllis Wheatley, and on the screen right now, you're seeing a photo of her. We have a site associated with Phyllis Wheatley. Women in all sorts of ways, both as, you know, consciously people fighting patriarchy, but also as workers, as anti-racist activists, as peace activists, feature very prominently across the various stories and sites that we share in the book.
Mm-hmm. So one of our guests wants to know if you did any research or have any sites related to Brookline.
So it wasn't a disagreement, but I demand that Joe explain.
So this was a really tough one for us. So, you know, Suren used to be a Brookline resident, right? So in one way we could hold him responsible for the fact that there's nothing in the book on Brookline. But this was, again, it was a very difficult decision for us to make, because we did generate a few sites related to Brookline. Mm-hmm. But again, we had to make some really tough decisions, right? So it wasn't that we were unaware of Brookline, just as we weren't unaware of, say, Brockton, right? Brockton's one of the largest cities in Massachusetts, and we ultimately decided not to include Brockton in the book. It's not meant to show disrespect or a lack of appreciation for what's important in those, but given the other choices, the other options we had, we decided for now not to include Brookline. We do intend to include sites from Brookline on the website. We reference Brookline in various ways, like so when we're talking about the nature, we have the Nature of Boston tour, we have the tour of the 1%. Brookline is mentioned in these, but we don't feature Brookline. And you know, in some ways we wish we had been given another 25,000 words by the press. But when they give you a word limit, for those of you familiar with publishing, that's a strict word limit. Right? You have to meet it. Otherwise it changes. If you exceed that, it changes the price of the book. And that's the last thing a publisher wants. So it's unfortunate that we didn't include Brookline, but we hope someone else will write a People's Guide to Brookline, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the same person wants to know if you can make those Brookline sites available. I'm assuming you're going to plan on putting them on your website, as you said, with, you know, the material that you have that you couldn't include.
Yes.
One way in which we dealt with it is that there were some stories to be told that would make most sense to locate in Brookline, but there were other parts of the city that could also tell that story. For example, the working man's, the Jewish working man's circle. We end up telling the story of the Labor Lyceum in Chelsea, which is now an empty parking lot, but was a central place for civilizing the entire North Shore in terms of work conditions and the creation of labor unions that would advocate for improved work conditions. So there were many stories that we could tell by referring to other places too.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the thematic tours that you have in the back, and I found those some of the most interesting because you're able to kind of tell a larger story from beginning to end of particular people in the Boston area. For example, Sacco and Vanzetti, and that trial that just illuminates a lot about xenophobia and the problems in the justice system, and how you use the walking tour to show that story from beginning to end. And I really love the Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who are two extremely important historical figures who spent a very formative period of their life in Boston. And you can't address those, or you didn't address those in the rest of the book, and I'm sure that you really wanted to get those in. So I think that was a really kind of creative way to tie some of these bigger stories together, and the whole landscape of Boston. So I think with that, since we don't have any more questions at this time, I'm going to wrap things up and say thank you to all three of you for taking the time to talk with us tonight. And it was really, really illuminating. And I'm sure that everyone involved, myself included, has a list of places they want to go now that may not have known even existed before.